who were hanging on for that. Otherwise, Arab Tov, everyone.
Good
Call, thank you.
call, Arthur.
Okay, Jeff, we'll see you.
Good to see you, Jeff. Herb, we're thinking about you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you for leading.
Good night, Dad.
Good night.
Where'd he go?
Hey,
He going already?
well, welcome back. And tonight we're going to try and do all of the High Middle Ages in by looking at 3 books. And the notion of these all as books makes sense for the first 2. The third one we'll talk about whether it's actually a book or not. But I want to start with a little bit of review from where we were. And let me, where's the shift there? And, oh, that's weird. I don't have the right document open. Oh, because, it was open because of Zoom. Hold on. That mode. And wrong thing. Slide 1, come on. There we are. Okay. Oh, it's still not shared. Sorry about this, people. How do I? Okay, this is not working right. Here's the Zoom. Here's, I have to, okay, it's very strange. I'm sharing this and now it's in present mode and we're going back to slide 2. Okay, so, good, now you've got it. So this is what we did in the very first class, as you may recall, from creation through the Hasmonean revolt, and then we looked at the Hellenistic period through the publication of the Mishnah, and then we looked at, oh, we're going to skip the third class, gets us all the way to the Talmud Bavli. Didn't mean to have that animated. And then tonight we're going to pick up with the Gaonic period. The Gaonic period is named after the Gaonim, that is the people who were the leaders of these big yeshivot. There were 2 major yeshivot, Sura and Pumbedita in Bavel, that is in modern day Iran. The Gaonim, which is cognate with our genius, right? These were the people who were the leaders of these yeshivot and became leaders of the Jewish people throughout the world during the rise of the Islamic Caliphate. And there you can see that's the date for when Islam begins approximately.
I can't find
And the Talmud Bavli is completed about this time, although some people are saying now a bit later. One of the major documents that frame the experience of Jews in the Islamic Caliphate is the Pact of Umar. It's actually written for both Jewish and Christian audiences. Basically, it sets up Jews as a secondary population, not second-class citizens, but protected, better than the people they called Am al-Harb, the people who deserve the sword, Harb, like Charav in Hebrew, meaning pagans or polytheists. We were Am al-Kitab, people who were peoples of the book, like Judaism and Christianity, and we were monotheists, and that was cool by them, and they wanted us to be monotheists. They just thought we had the wrong form of it. Islam spreads, and then I'll show you a map in a couple of slides. Islam spreads across North Africa all the way into Spain, and Jews follow along and there were already some Jews living in Spain, but they'd been somewhat persecuted. Under Islam, they began to thrive in Spain. We mentioned the Gaonic period. One of the really significant Gaonim, and one of the ones that we're going to be talking about today, is Amram Gaon, who did a lot to try and centralize the Jewish people, despite the fact that we were spread out all over the place. Sadia Gaon, another one who dealt with a serious threat to Gaonic authority, and that was the rise of Karaism, which was a group of people who split apart from Rabbinic Judaism, rejecting the authority of the Gaonim. Chasdai ibn Shaprut was a very important, sorry, that's a show. Chasdai ibn Shaprut was the leader of the Jewish community in Cordoba in Spain, which at the time became the largest city in the world, Cordoba, under the leadership of Abd ar-Rahman. Shmuel Hanagid, in the generation after Chasdai ibn Shaprut, also became both a political leader, probably until Michael Bloomberg, probably the most powerful Jew in Jewish history. And in both in terms of his wealth and his political influence. Yehuda Levi, great poet, in the next generation of people in Spain, and not just a poet but a philosopher. Very interesting to compare and contrast Yehuda Levi and especially his book The Kuzari with the work of Maimonides, but I focused on 3 books, so we're leaving the Kuzari out, but it's worth looking at. And then, of course, there's Maimonides, who we will be looking at, and specifically his Guide for the Perplexed. He was born in Spain, made his way to North Africa, and then to Egypt, where he became the Ras Al Yahud, the head of the Jewish community there. The Jewish community in Spain was split when Christian forces reconquered Spain from the north, and about halfway, when they got about halfway down to Sevilla, it really was quite significant, with the majority of Jews at that point living in Christian Spain and a smaller number in Muslim Spain. The Ramban, however, actually was in an area that had always been under Christian control. He lived in Girona. If you watched Game of Thrones, I think it was season 5 or season 6, a lot of it was filmed in Girona. We went there. It was actually really fun. We went on a tour that was a combination Jewish Girona and Game of Thrones Girona, and every time we would walk along the street, he'd pull out his little, he'd say, "Is this a Jewish spot or is this a Game of Thrones spot?" And when he pulled out his iPad, then we knew that it was a Game of Thrones spot, because he was going to show us a little clip. But very cool, worthwhile going to Girona. Hope that we can all do some traveling in the future. In that northern part of Spain, and especially in Castile, is where there was this efflorescence of study of Kabbalah and the emergence of the Book of the Zohar. And with that, we're going to conclude tonight. So I want to just review some of the things that we said at the end of the class last time, which was there were some major demographic changes in late antiquity. So if you take a look from the year 65 to the year 650, this is just the population in the land of Israel. The total population of Jews dropped from 5.5 million to about 1.3 million. By the end, you can see 0.8 million were in Bavel, and only 100,000 Jews were left in Eretz Israel at the beginning of the period that we're talking about now. It's a huge change. What we see eventually happening though, and what has continued to current times, is that we've got this immensely broad diaspora. How did that happen? Do we have this immensely broad diaspora? Now we explained that part of the reason why we ended up losing so many Jews was actually, at least according to the theory of Marcella Botticini and Victor Eckstein, that it was due to the cost of Jewish education. But that left us with a very small but literate Jewish population. The people who had stayed Jews were people who stayed Jews because they wanted to be Jewish. Largely that meant that they were hanging around in rabbinic circles, either that they were themselves students of the rabbis or that they accepted rabbinic authority in some kind of way. But they were literate. Now, when we think about literacy, we think about it as a tool for getting a better job or preparing for some kind of work. Back then, most of these Jews were farmers, and that was just not necessary. And in fact, take a look at this. Oh, I used little things. Take a look at this chart. Now, this is a really interesting chart that is based on a variety of different studies, but it compiles data from a lot of different studies. But take a look at the differences between what Jewish employment looked like in the period 1 to 400, 400 to 650, and 650 to 1250. And you can see that pretty much in the land of Israel and Bavel, it was fairly consistent. Jews were, like the rest of everybody else, they were mostly farmers. You see a somewhat of an uptick in crafts and trades by the year 650 in Bavel, not so much in Eretz Israel, but by 1250, it's entirely flipped. Whereas if you look at the general population, they're still mostly like this, right? Jews were like this, and at the same time that Jews were like this, most of the surrounding populations were 80 to 85 to 90% were farmers, and other people were involved in crafts and trade, and eventually for Jews also money lending, something that specifically Jews were involved in. So we've got a variety of big changes. One is this development of this huge diaspora, and the second is this major change in our employment. And the two actually go hand in hand. And this is, I think, a conclusion that Botticini and Eckstein make, which I think is pretty inescapable. The reason why Jews went into the trades and crafts and money lending and as major merchants was precisely because with the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate and the expansion of Islam, Jews now all of a sudden could move into these places and could engage in trade. And a variety of things that had developed while they were in Bavel became extremely helpful. Like their literacy, which didn't mean anything to them when they were farmers, all of a sudden now meant that they could make contracts. The fact that they had studied Talmud and that there were a lot of people who had studied Talmud in Bavel meant that they actually had a uniform structure for contract law. They had ways of communicating with each other and maintaining networks. All of these things reinforce in a virtuous cycle the development of the diaspora as people are looking for new markets, their success in exploiting those new markets as traders, and their ability to then plow those their profits, which were considerable, back into Jewish education, because they didn't have to get their kids to work because they had enough assets to be able to provide their kids with education while they worked until their kids were older, and then they could join into the family business. But this is a huge change, and you can see that this is the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, but you can also see that these are the same places that Jews were moving into, and there were major Jewish communities in Fustat and in Kairouan and in Fez and in Granada and Toledo and all of these places, and then eventually moving up into Ashkenaz as well. So I want to go start with looking at what Gaonic culture was like. And here I don't want to spend a lot of time on this text, but I think it's a really interesting one, worth giving it a quick skim. But basically, the chart here on the side shows the structure of how they would sit, at least how the top 70 students would sit in the Babylonian yeshiva. And we mentioned this actually in the context of the story from Talmud Bavli Menachot, where Moshe is in the back seat in the 8th row, but he didn't even make it into the top 7 rows. But it was incredibly hierarchical, with the people being in charge of individual rows, and you would be tested, and you could be moved forward or moved back based on how you were testing. And the Gaon, or the Rosh Yeshiva, would, or the person who was in charge of your row, would evaluate who's doing well and who they were going to move up, and who they were going to move back. It's kind of like in a symphony orchestra, right, or in an orchestra in general, where you would, you compete for getting first seat or whatever. That's what they would do. And you'll see in the last line here that it actually is also tied to your income, because these yeshivot were supported by Jews from all over the world. How did that work? Well, Jews would write questions. Well, actually, let's go to the next source, and this one's in your on the source sheet on Sefaria. This is a source from a guy named Natan Bavli. We're not exactly too sure about when Natan Bavli was actually writing, but his description of the Gaonic yeshiva seems to be pretty much the way things were going on. At least that's what Robert Brody and a lot of other scholars of the Gaonic period think. And what happened was that questions would be sent from all over the Jewish world, which is at this point had spread around, and they would ask the Gaonim to say, like, what are we supposed to do? And they would come, and for a period of people would assemble in Sura and in Pumbedita, in these great yeshivot, for the month of Adar and the month of Elul. That is Adar before Pesach, then they would go home for Pesach, and Elul before Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot, and then they'd go home for Yom Tov. But during that month there, they would study. So every day of Adar, the Rosh Yeshiva would come and bring out the questions, and they would all discuss them, and they would go through each one, and everybody would challenge each other and argue back and forth until it was clear what the right answer was going to be, and then they would write down the answers and send the answers back. And at the end of the month, they read the questions and the responses before the entire yeshiva, and then the Rosh Yeshiva would sign them, they'd send them off, and then he would divide the money among them based on where they ended up on where their seats was. If you were in the front seats, you got enough money to live on for the whole year. If you were in the second row, probably not as much, and so forth. That was the structure. It was very hierarchical. And you can see how communities from the Maghreb and from Ifriqiya, they would be sending back and forth responsa, and it would all go back through here because this was the center of the world. This was where the caliphate was located. It was kind of like they had the best mail, because it was like, I don't know, sending your mail to New York. It gets there. So this leads to some really interesting challenges. This is source sheet number 2. What happens if you send a question not just to the yeshiva of Sura, but also to the yeshiva of Pumbedita? What happens if you ask 2 different authorities the same question? What do you think's going on there?
I didn't like the first one. You get two different answers.
You could end up with two different answers, and that would be very bad, right? That may be exactly what you're looking for. And in fact, think about like the times when you asked your parents, or your parent or your kids asked you, and then also asked your spouse, to play each other off. Well, what could happen if they weren't necessarily on the same page. So this was asked of Nachshon ben Sarok Gaon, and they also asked Semach and Rav Matitia, and this was a serious problem for them. And they said, nobody ever did this before. This is horrible. Either they asked the sages of Sura or the sages of Pumbedita, but not both. And there's 87 miles between us, and they don't know what we would write, and we don't know what they would write, and this could cause a Chilul Hashem. And they say, you may not do that. Create a relationship with one yeshiva or the other. Don't ask both of us. Don't go picking around for the most lenient answer or whatever or the answer that you want to be the right answer. Create a relationship. And this is, of course, against their interest monetarily, right? Because if somebody has if a community, let's say the community of Ira 1 specifically has a relationship with the yeshiva of Sura, right? Why shouldn't Jews from Pumbedita want to be able to get some money out of that too, right? But against their own financial interest, both yeshivot agree this is absolutely horrible. Go with one authority and one authority only, and that's a really important point, because it lays out why they had to write the first Sidur. So I don't have a copy of the text version of Rav Amram Gaon's Sidur. You can get it on HebrewBooks.org. It's not so easy to follow, but it's mostly an instruction book, not a Sidur like what we think of, which is just a list of the texts, but it's mostly an instruction book. This is how you do this, and this is how you do that. And I'm going to answer all kinds of questions about Tefillah while we're doing it. And it was written actually to the Jews living in Barcelona. And they had written this question. We don't know how we were supposed to be davening. Well, why would they have a problem with that? Why would they not know how I mean, haven't they been davening for a long time? And the answer seems to be that with this expansion of the diaspora, you get Jews who are coming from all kinds of different places. So you've got communities now that are somewhat mixed up. We're going to see this as being a very big issue in the early modern period with the Shulchan Aruch, but it's not exactly clear. And there were local communities and local traditions, not clear how they were supposed to do things. So here's a great text from Seder Rav Amram Gaon, and they're talking about how you're supposed to recite the Shema. And they're not talking about what is in the Shema. Everybody agrees on what's in the Shema. But the question is, what posture do you take? And you may be familiar from the very third Mishnah in the Mishnah, where this is a discussion, and Beit Hillel says you should do it however you happen to be, right? So if you're seated, you should remain seated. If you're standing, you should remain standing. Whereas Beit Shammai says, no, you should lie down at night, because it says uv'shoch b'cha, and so you should be reciting the Shema in a seated or a lying down position. Whereas in the morning, when you say the Shema, you should be standing. That's the way it says in the Mishnah. And apparently, there are people who in Barcelona were behaving in a very different way. That is, they were standing all the time for the Shema. Very strange. And they say, those who try to be strict and recite the Shema while standing are guilty of stupid errors and nonsense. Why do they get so confused? We already established that the law is like Beit Hillel. And standing all the time makes no sense, because they not only are not acting like Beit Hillel, and they aren't acting like Beit Shammai either. Or if they were acting like Beit Shammai, they would be standing in the morning and reclining in the evening. But these people stand at both times. Can you be more foolish than that? Right? And the tone of Seder of Amram is like this all over the place. That is, they were trying to create a much more uniform mode of practice throughout this huge, diverse population that was spread out across the Islamic Caliphate. They wanted Jews to be the same. and they were trying to take their authority as being the Jews in the center. That is not really the center, but the Jews in the capital in Baghdad as the ways of trying to exert their authority, to make everybody follow exactly as they say you should be participating, or you should be davening, and in everything else as well. It was a big thing in their passages about the Haggadah in Seder Rav Amram Gaon and all kinds of things, where they sit there saying these are horrible. And if you say that you're just following the custom of the land of Israel, that's not true either, because in the land of Israel, they say the law is always according to Beit Hillel. You can't sit there and say you're just following this other custom. We're the ones we in Babel are the ones who are telling you how to do it, and you can't recite Shema that way, which is kind of an interesting text given the history of reciting the Shema in modern times, when the Reform movement adopted this particular practice of reciting Shema standing, because on the analogy of what you do with a doxology, and the way Christians would stand for like the Lord's Prayer. So Jews started standing for Kriyat Shema. So this one's from this book here, Seder Rav Sadia Gaon. And if you take a look on the right, those of you who have Hebrew are looking at it and saying, what the heck is that? And that's actually Judeo-Arabic. And so I included it because the text was originally written in Arabic. Can't really see that, can you? But this is from his Arabic Siddur. Now he includes the texts that you're supposed to recite in Hebrew, and there are, just like in Yiddish, there are words of Hebrew that make it into Yiddish, and there are words of Arabic that make it into Judeo-Arabic, and you can see some of them here. But he says, I'm going to create the right text. So whereas Rav Amram was really talking mostly about how do you do stuff, Sadia really is trying to create the first Siddur that's more like our Siddur, where it's a lot about the text of the Siddur. And he said, I'm going to create a book of the essential prayers in their original forms, okay, and create an ordered text, the Siddur. And I'll then add what I have heard has been added or deleted from according to what seems to me to have been additions of individuals. And I've prohibited anything which spoils the original intent. And any different version that does not spoil the meaning, I've still noted that it's not part of the original tradition. That is, he really wants to purify the tradition and make it uniform and unify the Jewish people through by doing this. And here is just to show you that there were other Gaonim who were involved in these efforts to try and make people uniform. They were also trying to do it inside the context of particular communities. So here is a responsum, and you can see Usha Shaltem, your shaila, your question that you asked was, one who comes late to the synagogue and finds the congregation reciting the Kedusha or responding to the Kaddish, may he respond when he is sitting and they are standing, or when he is standing and they are sitting? Or what's the best way to act? Like, I'm sitting, like, how do you do that, right? It's a good practical question. And his answer is, and you can kind of see why they would say this, it is best to act like them. When they are standing, one should stand. And when they are sitting, one should sit and not stand out at all from what the congregation is doing. That is, the focus here is on uniformity. And that informs a lot of Gaonic responsa. Okay, so let me just pull that down. Okay. So there were a lot of different kinds of responses to this effort of Gaonic authority. So a lot of people accepted Gaonic authority. They claimed that they had an ongoing, unbroken tradition. They wrote documents that talk about the authority of the Reish Galuta and the Gaonim going all the way back to Adam, which is kind of like what we saw with Mishnah Avot, right? That ongoing tradition. We have this kind of authority, and they ran for quite a long time because people would send money, along with their questions, and that would fund these yeshivot. So Gaonic authority continued in lots of places. But in other places, there were people who rejected Quranic authority in the entire rabbinic enterprise, and Karaites were much more of an issue back then than some scholars thought about or considered. There were lots of them. They still exist. I actually had, when I was teaching in Boston, there was a student who was a grade past Rabbi Spitzer, a grade ahead of Rabbi Spitzer, and a student who was 2 grades or 1 grade behind Rabbi Spitzer, who was my student. And they were Karaites. They came to the traditional egalitarian minyan. They did not wear tefillin because they thought that was a misreading, but they did wear tzitzis. And they were very good Torah readers because that was crucial to being a Karaite. But they rejected Quranic authority. They rejected the entire rabbinic enterprise at the time, and it caused all kinds of very interesting conflicts. One thing that was really important, though, is that the Islamic Caliphate itself began to fragment, starting with Abd ar-Rahman III in the 10th century in Cordoba. He said, "I'm no longer the emir of this area of the Islamic Caliphate. I am the caliph. That is, I am the person who is in charge." And he basically split it apart. And the same thing happened in Fushtat. And you have the Fatimid Caliphate, and you have the Umayyad Caliphate centered in Cordoba and then in Granada. And it basically, the caliphate fell apart. As it fragmented, different Jewish communities also claimed authority for themselves. They said, "Why should we be sending money off to Baghdad? We've all studied. We've got our own great teachers. Chasdai ibn Shaprut is here, and Chasdai ibn Shaprut and Shmuel Hanagid, people I mentioned earlier, brought people into their communities, importing them from all over the Islamic Caliphate to build up the scholarship that was going on in Cordoba." And the same thing happened in Egypt, and not so much in Eretz Israel, but there was its own kind of authority there. So that pretty much moves us past the Gaonic, the end of the Gaonic period. Do you have any questions about materials that we've looked at so far? No? Okay. So we're going to go on. And here again was the map. And if you can, I can't point to it like that. Here up in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, what they call Al-Andalus. Okay. Here in Cordoba was the center. And here in Granada was where Shmuel Hanagid was. And we're now going to talk about the development of Jewish culture in Al-Andalus in Spain, and we're going to begin by talking about Maimonides. This is a funny story that my wife likes to tell. She was the head of Jewish studies at day school in Stoughton, Massachusetts, and she had projected on her wall this picture of Maimonides, and the Spanish teacher came in and said, "That is Maimonides. He is from," and she said, "I stood at that statue," which is like, very excited because from her perspective, this is a Spanish cultural artifact and not just a Jewish one. So Maimonides wrote a variety of different works. His 3 major works, however, were the commentary to the Mishnah. And here is a copy of that commentary to the Mishnah. And you'll note, take a look, right? You'll note that it also has these 2 columns in here. That's because, again, he wrote the commentary of the Mishnah in Arabic. The edition that I have has the Judeo-Arabic, that is Arabic written in Hebrew letters, and a translation by a really competent Judeo-Arabic scholar named Yosef Kapach. He also wrote an amazing code called the Mishneh Torah, which is the first real complete code of Jewish law. It still is the only complete code of Jewish law. We'll talk about what complete means next week because it's necessary to our discussion of the Shulchan Aruch. And that was written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew of the Mishneh Torah actually became a template for people like Eliezer ben Yehuda when they were rewriting, when they were updating Hebrew for the modern age. This became that style of Hebrew in the Mishneh Torah became a huge influence on modern Hebrew. So you'll find Mishneh Torah is really worthwhile, an easy book to read for those people who have modern Hebrew because they're related. The Guide for the Perplexed, that's this book, the Moreh Nevuchim. Actually, my edition is 3 volumes. And also, again, you can see has the Judeo-Arabic with a Hebrew translation for me, because I don't have I don't have much Arabic at all. But so his two of his major works, the Commentary of the Mishnah and the Guide for the Perplexed, were written in Arabic. That's because that was their language, right? Hebrew was, they were not as fluent as that in that. In fact, earlier than Maimonides, there was a guy named Menachem ibn Saruk, who was being supported by Chasdai ibn Shafrut, who was incredibly wealthy. And Menachem ibn Saruk, one of his major contributions was he wrote a dictionary of the Hebrew language. And the definitions were written in Arabic. And that's because their Arabic was better than their Hebrew. And they wanted to be able to write in Hebrew. And they wrote lots and lots of beautiful poetry in Hebrew. They needed a dictionary to do it because they didn't have that skill. This is the cover page from an illuminated edition of the Guide for the Perplexed. The Guide for the Perplexed is the book that we're going to be looking at, and it is an amazing work of philosophy where you'll see how the Rambam tries to integrate a vision of traditional rabbinic Judaism with Aristotle's physics, metaphysics, and poetics. He wrote most of this while he was serving as the Ras al-Yahud in Egypt, that is the head of the Jews in Egypt, which was as an example of the ways in which the Islamic Caliphate had fallen apart. As the Ras al-Yahud, he was basically the Gaon for that Jewish community. And responsa in the area would go to him. And there are collections of Maimonides' responsa, some of which are amazingly interesting, but there wasn't a consistent effort to reproduce his responsa. So that's when people talk about his major works, they talk about these 3, they don't talk about his collections of responsa. So I want to begin now with a passage from the Guide for the Perplexed. It's actually towards the end of the 3rd part of the Guide for the Perplexed, and it's what he called what's called the parable of the palace. And I drew you a little visual, so hopefully it'll help you a little with the parable. But he's beginning with this chapter with the parable of the king who's in this palace. Some of his subjects are inside the city, so this is the city, right? And some are outside, right? So the first group of people are outside the city, the second group of people are inside the city. Of the ones in the city, some face away from the palace. So you have to imagine some people are in the city, and some people are outside of the city, some people are in the city, but they're facing the wrong way from the palace, okay? And some try to find the palace, that is, they're facing the right way, but they haven't even seen the walls. They're like way out here on the edges. They have never even gotten to the palace. They're not going the wrong direction, but they still can't find the palace. Some walk around the walls, and they're just walking around the walls, but they can't find the gate. and others have actually entered the gate and walk in the outer hall. Some have entered the inner court with the king, but that does not mean that they see the king or speak with him. For even after coming into the inner court, they have to do still more to actually be in the king's presence right there, okay? To see him from far away or up closer, to hear the king speak or to speak to him, right? That doesn't happen unless you're like way, like really, really special. And you might hear in this description, this kind of like echoes of this hierarchical vision that we saw in the Gaonic period. It's not surprising, right? The Gaonim were still functioning, and that kind of hierarchical thinking was typical for the period. It was not, by the way, as you recall, as typical of the Talmudic period, where it was much more, I don't want to say egalitarian, and a lot of our reconstruction of what happened in the Talmudic period happens from these stories that were written at the very end of the Talmud, which were influenced by that same thing. So it's hard to tell, but it doesn't seem like the hierarchy was such a huge thing. But for the Rambam, this is really important. And now he's going to explain it. Those outside the city, that is the people over here, are people who have no conception of true religion, either from study or from tradition. They're just like, these people have no idea about religion. And then there are those who are in the city with their backs to the palace, right? That is the people who are walking this way, right? Who have incorrect beliefs, either because they came up with them themselves or because they learned them from tradition, from someone who led them into error. That is, there are a lot of traditional beliefs that people have, that they learn from other people, and they're just wrong. They are incorrect beliefs. And these people are not headed toward the palace at all. They're still inside the city, but they're not going to find the palace because every time they go along, they're walking farther and farther away from it. And then they're the ones who want to get to the palace, who've never seen it, and those are the masses who observe the law. That is the Amei Haaretz, who observe the mitzvot. That is, most Jews, they observe the mitzvot, they have no idea what they're doing. They want to go to the palace. They're not holding on to the incorrect beliefs, or at least not too many incorrect beliefs, and they're heading mostly towards the palace, but they might miss it. They might be going skew. It's not clear, right? And then they're the ones who walk around the wall, but they're never going to get inside the gate. They just keep on going around and around the palace, never finding the gate. And those are the people who've studied Talmud and have correct beliefs based on tradition, but don't ask them the basic questions of religion or truth. And here he's making a huge statement, right? The way you advanced in the Babylonian yeshiva, the way in which you showed yourself to be skillful was because of your Talmud knowledge. And the Rambam here is dissing people who just know Talmud. You just know Talmud, you don't know anything because you've never gone past that. You don't ask yourself the big questions, the basic questions of religion and truth. And you're never going to get inside the palace. You'll walk around the walls, but you're never going to make it inside. And then you get those people who've entered the gates, and they're the ones who've begun to inquire into the roots of belief. And there are different kinds of levels here. Some people have started asking, what does it really mean to say that God has an outstretched hand, or that God punished people, or that God created the world? What does that mean? People who are asking those questions, they're inside the gates. But that's as far as they've got. But one who's truly acquired perfect understanding of nature and divine ordering of the world has entered into the court of the king. They get there into the court, right? And again, there are different levels here. And one who's achieved perfection in divine science and turns entirely towards God and rejects everything that is not God and directs his mind entirely towards God, this is the level of the prophets. Those are the people who are like that. And Maimonides would humbly, or not so humbly, think, and that's where I am too, right? I'm here, right? I'm the philosopher. I'm at this level of prophecy. So you've got this very, very interesting way of of looking at traditional knowledge. And it's quite different than what you would see in Bavel, in the Gaonic Yeshiva, right? For him, the big questions are the questions of nature and science, and past that, metaphysics. And you can't get to metaphysics until you've mastered physics. And physics means for him all of the nature and science that you would study in Aristotle. And then you have to go beyond, and you have to start asking yourself the real questions, and then analyzing the tradition in light of those things. So let's take a look at, for instance, the example of mitzvot and why you do mitzvot, right? So if you look in the Torah, it's pretty clear. Torah has a couple of different kinds of philosophical statements, but by and large, this is the crucial idea. You observe the mitzvot, and God rewards you. You don't observe the mitzvot, and God punishes you, right? That's basically the way the Bible describes things. And the Rambam has serious problems with that. Let's take a look what he actually says. So this is also from the third part of the guide. The law as a whole aims for two things: the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. As for the welfare of the soul, it consists in the multitudes acquiring correct opinions according to their respective capacity. That is, you take care of your soul by learning, by reflection, by thinking. And if you do acquire correct opinions about what's going on, not and as much as you can, then the Torah is doing the mitzvot. That's what it's for. Okay, so if you do the mitzvot and study the Torah, it's supposed to give you correct opinions if you do it right. And as for the welfare of the body, it comes about by the improvement of their ways of living with one another. It is not, right, you do the mitzvot and the rain comes. It is not that you do the mitzvot and you can gather in good harvest. It is you do the mitzvot and that makes for a better life. That happens through a couple of ways. One is the abolition of their wronging of one another. If you do mitzvot, you're going to be better people, and you're not going to wrong each other, and that's good. And the other one is that you're going to acquire moral qualities that are useful for life in society, so that the affairs of the city may be ordered. So you do the mitzvot, you study the Torah, and that's going to make you a better person, and it's going to make you a better citizen. Right? That's what the Rambam sees as the purpose of these mitzvot. Okay? And in terms of your soul, you're going to get better opinions. You're going to reflect on these things, and clearly the welfare of the soul is more important, but the welfare of the body is necessary. Whoops, sorry. The welfare of the body is necessary, and you can't take care of the soul until you've taken care of the body. And he goes on that theme. Okay. So thinking about this, right? He has a totally naturalist perception of the Torah. But it's not just that. He also believes that nature is revelation. Nature is revelation. That is, he does not, and this passage is not the passage that proves this, but he doesn't really believe, if you read the guide carefully, he doesn't really believe, even though he occasionally talks about it, that anything happened at Sinai. Not that nothing happened at Sinai, historical event from his perspective, but the revelation that Moses had at Sinai could have happened at any time. All it matters is that same revelation comes through study of the physics and study of the metaphysics. And nature reveals that at all times to anybody who's ready to learn it. So you didn't have to be at Sinai to receive all of the Torah. And here you can see him making a rather snarky comment about the way in which people relate to miracles, which of course, from his perspective, there's only one kind of miracle worth looking at. And the kind of miracle that people actually believe in is usually ridiculous. How great is the blindness of ignorance, and how harmful. If you told a man who is one of those who deem themselves the sages of Israel that the deity sends an angel who enters the womb of a woman and forms the fetus there, he would be pleased with this assertion and would accept it and would regard it as a manifestation of greatness and power on the part of the deity, and also of his wisdom may be exalted. That is, if you imagine that God actually is involved in sending an angel and making it possible for a person to, for a woman to become pregnant, that's a supernatural miracle. These guys, they'd believe it. And he thinks that's totally ridiculous. But if you tell him that God has placed in the sperm a formative force shaping the limbs and giving them their configuration, which he got straight out of Aristotle, the man would shrink from this opinion, for he does not understand the notion of the true greatness and power in this. That is, the miracles are the miracles of nature. And you learn about God and God's miracles through understanding the natural world. There are no supernatural miracles. That's just not important to him. A contrast, compared to Yehuda Levi, who I said I wasn't really going to talk about, but I'll put in one little plug about this, right? When you look at the Rambam focuses hugely on the issues of creation and cosmology. That's because the world is revelation for him. When you look at Yehuda Levi, he doesn't talk about the creation at all. He emphasizes the Exodus from Egypt because that's God intervening in history. And God reveals God's self by violating nature, by entering into history and acting. This is the starkest difference between Yehuda Levi and Maimonides. And for Maimonides, it's just not going to happen that you're going to that a person with right opinions is going to focus on miracles or believe that God acts that way. It just doesn't happen. And you have to have the right opinions, because if you don't affect the right opinions, you're not going into the gates, you're not going into the inner court. So you really have to study a lot and reflect and think. And here he makes a really interesting comment about prayer. A lot of people have looked at this passage. I think it's not as clear as some people want to make it, but I think it is pretty. You can get a good sense of it. It's impossible to go from one extreme to another. One can not stop everything to which he has become accustomed. The custom which was in the days of the Bible common among all, and the mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted of sacrificing animals in temples. It was God's plan and wisdom not to command us to give up this form of worship, because that would have been against our nature. People cling to their habits. This is actually a huge concept of the Moreh Nevuchim, and it's also in the Mishnah Torah, where he talks, especially in his Hilchot Deot, his laws of characteristics. If you studied the Rambam's laws of tshuva, you've also seen that he is real focused on this issue of people are habitual, right? It takes a lot of work to break those habits. So God didn't want us to try and have to break our habits. So that's why God allowed sacrifice to continue. By getting rid of the trappings of idolatry while allowing sacrifice, the truly great principle of our religion, the unity of God, was firmly established. Sacrifice is not the primary intention, but prayer is closer to that primary intention. So he's saying, when the Bible has all of this stuff about sacrifice, it's not that that's what God actually wants. That's a concession to who we are or who we were. And now that we're at prayer, well, that's better. It's not the ideal, right? The ideal for the Rambam would not be davening 3 times a day. The ideal would be, if you're going back to that passage we looked at about the palace, would be focusing entirely on God, would be sitting and meditating and focusing on the philosophy. You don't need prayer if that's what you're thinking about, because then your entire life is about God. Your entire focus is about God. You don't need prayer for that. So that's why it says it's closer. It's not the right thing. It's not bad. It's way better than sacrifice, that's for sure. And sacrifice has all kinds of problems, because if you sacrifice animals, then you're going to believe that God actually needs the sacrifices. God forbid you should believe that, because he doesn't want that, right? And this is one more aspect of the Rambam, and I think it's a huge one. And this is this idea of esoteric knowledge. So the Mishnah talks about, in Mishnah Chagiga 1:8, talks about things that you can and cannot teach in public, and how do you teach them? And so it talks about Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. You've heard about mysticism. Maaseh Merkava is what the rabbis were talking about in terms of mysticism. Maaseh Bereshit is speculation about cosmology. For the Rambam, Maaseh Bereshit is physics, and Maaseh Merkava is metaphysics, right? And he says, you know, my goal here is to try and explain the physics and the metaphysics as far as I can within certain kind of limits. Because we've also stated that these subjects belong to the mysteries of the law. You're well aware of how our sages blame those who reveal these mysteries and praise the merits of those who keep them secret, although they are perfectly clear to the philosopher. They've clearly stated that the divine chariot, that is the Merkava, includes matters too deep and too profound for the ordinary intellect. It's been shown that a person favored by providence with reason to understand these mysteries, meaning me, Maimonides, right? Right? It's forbidden by the law to teach them except through direct speech, and it was never committed to writing. So what am I going to do? The Rambam says as he's writing his book, right? How can I venture to call your attention to such portions of it as may be known, intelligible, and perfectly clear to me? I get it. I could write it, right? But if, on the other hand, I were to abstain from writing on this subject, according to my knowledge of it, then the knowledge would die with me, and I would thus inflict great injury on you and all those who are perplexed. I should, in either case, be guilty of gross misconduct. Either he's going to not tell you, in which case the information is going to die, or he's going to tell you, despite the fact that he knows that once he writes it, people are going to get confused and they're going to misunderstand it, which is true, because the following history is the ways in which everybody has misread or understood the Rambam to mean what they think he means when it's not clear. And people read the Rambam and read it as the source for Kabbalah. You should go and listen to somebody who's actually, I'm not telling you to do this, but if you happen to listen to a Chabad person talk about the Rambam, it makes him sound like he's a Kabbalist. And the Rambam was as far from being a Kabbalist as you could imagine. We'll talk about that in a second. But the point here is that there's esoteric knowledge. You're not going to get it unless you've been, as he says, favored by providence. You have to have a certain kind of mindset to be able to become the philosopher, to be able to get to that, into that inner court. And if you can get there, that's great. And if you can't get there, you're not going to get there. And I'm going to give you the headlines, but I'm not going to tell you more than the headlines, because that would be problematic for me and for you. This bit about esoteric knowledge, I think, is one of the ways in which the Rambam actually has a direct impact on the emergence of the Kabbalah. So I want to quote. Okay, let's before we get back to or go on to the connection between Maimonides and the Kabbalah, and look at just a few texts from the Zohar. And I gave you a lot more texts from the Zohar, which are worthwhile looking at in the Sefaria source sheet. Took me a while to decide which ones I wanted to teach and which ones I could get to in the time allotted. So I made I think a judicious choice about which texts I wanted to include. But because I like those other texts, I put them in the source sheet. So you're more than welcome to look at those as well. But before we get on to how Maimonides may have been related to the emergence of Kabbalah, let's pause and ask, do people have questions about Maimonides and his beliefs, some of which may seem, I hope, a bit radical to you? You can just unmute yourself if you have any questions about that. Is this
Did he, Did he have a circle of students, a wide circle of students to whom he imparted these things
So
directly?
not so much in Egypt. He was in Egypt, and there are a couple of North African students of the Rambam who did significant work. Not least of which was his son Avraham ben Rambam. But the area that was the hotbed of study of the Rambam was actually in Provence and in Catalonia. And those were the areas where people were really studying the Rambam intensely. There was a huge amount of effort to try and make sense of his philosophical work. And at the same time, there were a lot of people who were very, very opposed to his work right there in the same place. And it became part of a major controversy because people would look at what he was saying, which you could read and say, well, if he thinks the point behind the mitzvah is this, then if you got the point behind it, why do you need to do the mitzvah? Right? So people would misrepresent the Rambam as an antinomian when he was not. But they would also say that many of his philosophical ideas, like rejecting the idea of reward and punishment, was a real problem. In fact, the Rambam had a very interesting way of describing why does the Torah include reward and punishment in the Bible if God doesn't actually reward or punish. And he came up with this idea that it is a necessary but untrue belief. It's necessary that people believe in reward and punishment, otherwise society falls apart. Because most people need that. So he said it was a necessary belief. God put it in the Torah because otherwise society wouldn't be able to function. But it's not really true. Yeah, Steve.
I noticed that Rambam has tweaked the term Amei Haaretz in the parable of the city. In the Talmud, that means someone who is not observant, usually not observant of the laws of tithing. But he's used it to mean someone who is not knowledgeable. Is that connected to his larger philosophical shift?
Yes, but you're missing a step. That is, Amei Haaretz in the Mishnah specifically means people who aren't careful about tithing. By the time you get to Amoraic level, Amoraic documents, and in the Talmud, Amei Haaretz means people who are not within the rabbinic orbit. People who, because nobody's actually serious about tithing at that point after the destruction of the temple. And when the Mishnah is talking about tithing, again, they're not really tithing in the way that you need to in the time of the Mishnah. It's kind of a retroactive, like this is the way it was in the temple, and we're pretending that the temple hasn't been destroyed. But in the Talmud, Am Haaretz means somebody who is not rabbinic. And he takes it and says, an Am Haaretz is not somebody who's not rabbinic. They are rabbinic. They are Amei Haaretz who are Shomrei Mitzvot. So what is an Am Haaretz for him? Someone who's not philosophically grounded, right? And if you take a look at the works of Shmuel HaNagid, especially, he has all of this great poetry, but some of his poetry is just incredibly acerbic and nasty towards people who study Talmud but don't study other things, and are, from his perspective, ignorant. And there was a huge conflict over what constitutes the appropriate curriculum for Jews in Spain. And all of the people that we know about pretty much are people who adopted what was the modern curriculum, which included the study of physics and metaphysics. And Yehuda Halevi, despite the fact that he came to totally different conclusions at the Rambam, had pretty much the same kind of education that the Rambam had, as did Shmuel HaNagid before him and Chasdai ibn Chaprut before him. And these were people who were learning the same kinds of neoclassical work that was being resurrected in the Arabic speaking world. And you studied Aristotle through his Arabic interpreters. And if you didn't do that, you were an Am Haaretz. You were ignorant. Any other questions about the Rambam?
On this point, so today when we say law, Amaretz Chosid,
Yeah.
we have that meaning, that it's a person who is not learned, who has not studied, who is not nuanced, etc. Is that right?
Well, the term by the time people are using ein am haaretz chasid, okay, which is actually a quote from Avot, right? Is whatever culturally you think of as being the culturally crucial parts of education or of practice. They don't have it. They can't be truly pious. That is, in every generation, Jews have looked at what they think of as being most important and said, if you don't have this, you can't really be truly pious. So I don't know that, I don't think that people nowadays who would say this would say people who don't know philosophy, like the Rambam was saying, are can't be pious, because philosophy isn't what we consider crucial. But we would say, you have to. I would say that this idea of having a certain degree of nuance is part of it, right? I'm not so wild about the chassid part in any case. Now let's go on to the Zohar, and take a look. And I'm just going to summarize the claim that Gretz makes. Basically, he says that people had a real hard time with the claim that all you need for Judaism is Aristotelian philosophy, and you really need, and a lot of people believe, including myself, that you have to focus on divine truth. There's a revelation involved, and it's not just about Aristotelian philosophy. If you could just get it from Aristotle, why wasn't there? Like why didn't we get the Torah in Greek? Right? And why don't we just read Aristotle? And so people rejected it. Some people said, okay, let's just reject that, and we're just going to focus on halacha. And he says that's what they were doing in Ashkenaz. But the people in Spain who had been exposed to this philosophy and all this kind of stuff, they were also probably have problems with Aristotelian philosophy. So they invent the Kabbalah. They invent the Kabbalah. He says the Kabbalah is the daughter of embarrassment. Its system was the way of escape from the dilemma between the simple anthropomorphic interpretation of the Bible and the shallowness of Maimonist philosophy, right? So this is how Gretz describes it. Now, since Gretz in the 19th century wrote this, there's been a huge amount of study of Kabbalah, and it's just not, it doesn't follow. That is, it's clear that Kabbalah has a lot of ancient traditions, that they're working with a lot of old material and interpretations of the Talmud that lend themselves to Kabbalistic ideas. And at the same time, the Kabbalah has a huge amount of material that is just totally new. And all of this, the entire development that you see in the Sefer Bahir of the Sfirot, which we're going to take, which you can look at all over the place, is a whole new structure. And the Zohar, which we're going to look at, the Zohar creates this entire narrative of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his chavraya, his peers, who would walk around and discuss things, and it was structured around an interpretation of the Torah, a whole new mythology built on fragments of rabbinic work. Now, most of this emerged in Castile under the influence of people. And there's an entire Catalonian Kabbalah, and the Ramban, not the Rambam, the Ramban in Catalonia was a huge mikubal, great thinker about these ideas. And the book that we ultimately call the Zohar Gretz says, oh, it was written by Moshe de Leon, who was one of these Mekubalim. And that may be correct, but it may not be. And there are people like Yehuda Liebes who say, no, it's a collective document, and you can see that parts of it have very different styles, and I imagine that there was somebody who was like the leader of the group. Maybe that was Moshe de Leon, maybe it was Judah Katila, and there were a bunch of other people who were writing, and it was a kind of a collaborative document. And most recently, I've been reading people who think, like Elliot Wolfson, that are thinking of the Zohar as a book is actually anachronistic. It was a collection of materials that was put together, but eventually, with the emergence of printing, when they decided these are the things we're going to call the Zohar, and these other things that we didn't have access to, or we decided not to include, they're not the Zohar. And it's not necessarily clear whether it's actually a book in that way, that where the printer decides this is the material, I'm printing it as a book. But the material, most of it, seemed to be emerging in late 13th century Castile. We have plenty of named works by these people. It's in a Aramaic that doesn't look like any other Aramaic. It's a very, very strange style. If you're interested, I mean, there are new editions of this, and this is a Pritzker edition of the Zohar, put together by Daniel Matt. It has an extensive commentary, and it's quite good. The translations that I've included here are from that. So I want to take time to look through this through this first passage here, and it gives you a sense of their conception of this of esoteric knowledge. This is, by the way, I think the biggest connection between Maimonides. It's not that people rejected Maimonides' rationalism and so they created this whole new thing, but rather Maimonides had this focus on esoteric knowledge, and all these people who had been exposed to that said, no, we still need revelation, and instead of esoteric knowledge that you get access to because you do philosophical speculation, this esoteric knowledge you get from Kabbalah, that is a transmission, and you get it from these teachers, and one teacher is going to teach another teacher, is going to teach a student, and you're going to get this. Okay, so let's pull this text apart, and I'm going to want you to try and pull the thing apart. This may be compared to a man who dwelled among the cliffs and knew nothing of those dwelling in the town. He sowed wheat, and he ate the kernels raw. One day he went to the town and was offered good bread. The man asked, "What's this for?" They replied, "It's bread to eat." He asked, "And what's this made of?" They replied, "Wheat." Afterwards, they brought him cakes kneaded with oil. He tasted them and he asked, "And what are these made of?" They replied, "Wheat." And later they brought him royal pastry, kneaded with honey and oil. And he asked, "What are these made of?" They replied, "Wheat." And he said, "Surely I am Lord of all these, since I eat the essence of all these." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world which were lost to him. So it is with one who grasps the principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights deriving and diverging from that principle. Okay, this is a parable. So every element is supposed to be something that you can actually interpret. So what do you think wheat is? I can't hear you. You're muted. Miriam, you're muted. Anybody have any idea what wheat might be?
It's a question.
What's wheat might be?
What is the wheat in this parable?
What is the wheat? No.
At the end, he says, "So it is with one who grasps the principle." But what do you think the principle means? What is the wheat?
Torah.
Torah. The wheat's the Torah. Now, there are 4 things to eat here. There's wheat, there's bread, there's cake, and there's royal pastry. I'm dying to know what royal pastry was. Okay.
Baklava.
Okay. Wheat, bread, cake, and royal pastry. Okay. So there's 4 different things. And no, he doesn't even taste the royal pastry. Right? He tastes the bread, he eats wheat regularly, he tastes the bread, he tastes the cake, but he doesn't even taste the royal pastry. He doesn't need to. I know it because I eat the essence. Right? Now, the idea of 4 different versions of wheat, that could be what the Mekubalim developed as this idea of shat and drash and remez and so. That is the basic contextual meaning, the midrashic meaning, that is the way the rabbis would read it, the mode of allegory, and then the mystical hidden meaning. And because this guy said, I eat wheat, I know wheat, he never got to the royal pastry.
Royal pastry.
He didn't need it, never got there. Okay. And I think that from the perspective of the Zohar, right, most people are like that. And at the same time, unlike the Rambam, who's really reticent about people knowing esoteric knowledge, he doesn't want to tell you. He wants to say, I'll give you the headlines, but more importantly, I'll give you a curriculum you can study and you can develop it. And if you happen to be gifted from Providence to understand this stuff, then you can get it. But the Mekubalim were not like that. It was esoteric knowledge that they wanted to tell you, but at the same time, they were going to reveal it to you. So you've got things that are very unclear and very weird in the Zohar, but other things are also very weird. But then they wrote piles of these books and pamphlets that explain parts of it in very clear language. So for instance, I'm sure all of you are familiar, even if you've never even really looked at the chart of the Sfirot. This is the one that's from the Pritzker edition of the Zohar. But this is a really obscure thing. And the reason why in each different thing they have multiple different names, because the Zohar actually rarely ever uses the language of Sfirot. He uses these terms that refer to the different Sfirot. And you can see all of these different terms, like all the different terms Tiferet is called, right? It's called Rachamim, and the Blessed Holy One, and heaven, and the sun harmony, and the king green, and the torso, and Jacob, and Moses. And whenever these things, like, they're all about these codes that you're not supposed to be able to understand directly. But at the same time, they were also publishing these books that kind of give you guideposts, so it makes it much easier to study. Now, one of the basic ideas of the Sfirot in general is that there is an ayin, that is there's this no thingness, not nothingness, but no thingness. It's not, there's no thingness to God above Keter. But then there and Keter is actually still also the ayin. But Chochmah is kind of like a point, a primordial point, which enters into Bina, into wisdom, and which is a womb, and that gives birth to the rest of the Sfirot. And the Sfirot are this kind of androgynous conception of different ways in which God's essence emerges. And people talk about it. You can see the way people think of it, and Sfirot are described in terms of body parts. That's because, right, you've got the left arm and you've got the right arm, and you've got the left leg and the right leg, and you've got the phallus, and you've got the vagina, which is, I mean, it's it's this kind of androgyne image of God, which of course has to be the way that God is, because humanity is created in God's image. So of course they're going to look at this and say, oh, God is this way. And even though there's no physicality about this, right? So they're going to use those metaphors. And beyond that, they're going to say that the real issue and the real challenge is the fact, and they get this from, interesting readings of materials from Bereshit Rabbah and stuff like that, is that initially humanity was one, that these things were not separated. These things become separated, that Adam was a duprosopon, who got split. That's in the Midrash. They read it and say, so God was initially just this one transcendent thing, and God's energy got spread out through these different sphirot and ultimately emerges out into the world, connected to the world, and that's God's presence, the Shekhinah, down here, which is also called Malchut. And when Jews do mitzvot, Jews help unite and make the flow of energy through these sphirot work better. And this is a whole mythology through which they understand all of the Torah and all kinds of aspects of the way God functions. And so just think about this issue of mitzvot. When the Gaonim were talking about mitzvot, they were talking about, I want you to do the mitzvot my way. It wasn't about what the mitzvot did, other than the fact that if you do the mitzvot my way, that's going to unify Israel. That's what we want. For Rambam, mitzvot create a good society. But there is no reward and punishment like the Torah talks about. Mitzvot create a good society. They inculcate good opinions. Mitzvot create good moral qualities. And for the Mekubalim, right, these Kabbalists, mitzvot restore order and the function of the Godhead in the world. It causes the energy to flow properly. So I want to conclude with this focus on the mitzvot and their importance. And this is a text that probably was contemporary with the other text from the late 13th century, but didn't get included. And it's called the Zohar HaChadash because the people who published the original Zohar didn't include it, but it's probably from the same period. Although this one was written in Hebrew as opposed to not in that weird Aramaic. Rabbi Yochanan said, the Holy Blessed One said, Adam, I created you above all of my creations and breathed into you the soul of life, Nishmat Chayim, which gives life to its owner, and it's cut from my throne. But you returned yourself to a living spirit, a Nefesh HaChaya, that should be Hachaya, right? I missed an A. Which I created from the earth for the animals. That is, you were initially a soul, you had this soul of life that was right from my throne, and now you are just like an animal because you sinned. On your life, from here on, any who are occupied with my Torah and observe it, I will give to them the living soul, that is the Nishmat Chayim, from my throne, which gives life to its owner. And all of those who are not occupied with my Torah, their portion will be with that living spirit they chose, the Nefesh HaChaya, that they chose, and they perish with it, just like animals die. Rabbi Chia says, if so, non-Jews only have that living spirit, that Nefesh HaChaya. And Rabbi Yochanan said, indeed, yes. Okay, and this is we didn't study Yehuda Levi, but Yehuda Levi already has a very clear conception that non-Jews are somehow different than Jews, okay? That they are essentially different. He says non-Jews, including converts to Judaism, are not capable of prophecy. Jews are the only ones who are capable of prophecy because they've got this
Prophecy.
special inyan Elohi. Jews can do this, right? For the Rambam, Jews and non-Jews are essentially the same. They just accept different understandings. They have different understandings of God and the mitzvot, right? A good analogy, contrast Yehuda Levi with the Rambam, would be computers, right? For Yehuda Halevi, Jews are PCs and no, Jews are Macs and the rest of the world are PCs. Okay, you just can't run Jewish software on a non-Jew. The Jew has special software and special hardware. They've got different. They function differently. For the Rambam, everybody's a PC, and they just run different operating environments. One's Linux, one's Microsoft, but it runs on whatever hardware you want. We all have the same hardware. We're just running different software. We run the Torah software, the mitzvah software. They don't, right? For the Mekubalim, it goes a step way beyond where Yehuda Levi was. It's not just that they don't have an inyan Eloki, this divine aspect. They actually have a lower, different animal soul. The Kabbalah is actually structured around this belief. And it's one of the reasons why I don't spend too much time studying Kabbalah, because I have a real hard time with this idea. But this idea becomes central to all Kabbalistic systems, so much so that if you read, it's in, I think, the second chapter of the Tanya, which is the major work of Kabbalah of Chabad Hasidus, right? Comes straight out in the second, right, in the second section of the Tanya, that Jews have a different kind of soul and non-Jews have an animal soul, and it's a real problem. It's a very different conception of the world. So, if we summarize all of the High Middle Ages now through these three books, we've got the Siddur, which was a response to the diversity that emerged because of demographic spread and the emergence of this huge diaspora of the Jews. And because Jews were bouncing around all over the place and creating new kinds of communities where people were moving into their communities and they didn't know what to do. So as an effort to unify Israel, they published the Siddur. This effort failed. Right? It failed for a variety of reasons. One, because the power base, the Islamic Caliphate itself fell apart, because people didn't like to be told exactly what to do and you couldn't have differences, and because people had created different theological options like the Karaites. Then we have the Guide, the More Nevuchim of the Rambam, which was a response to philosophy. That is, the Rambam learned philosophy and then tried to integrate it. From his perspective, mitzvot preserve the body and the soul through natural means. It's about politics, it's about society, sociology, but it's not about miracles and God intervening in the world, because God just doesn't do that. There are no supernatural miracles. There is no intervention. God doesn't reward and punish. And there's esoteric knowledge which can be discovered by the worthy upon reflection. If you've got the ability, you're going to come to it on your own through your own reflection and philosophical speculation. And that's how, through the study of physics, you're going to get to the metaphysics. You're not going to make mistakes, and you're going to come up with a clear and prophetically clear vision of God, like Moses, who saw God through a clear lens, right? And when he talks about that, you can tell that Moshe Maimonides is talking about Moses himself as well as Moshe Rabbeinu. And then you've got the Zohar, which is this entire new mythological overlay on top of rabbinic tradition. In some ways, it's a response to rationalism, perhaps rejecting the idea that you don't need revelation or that nature is revelation, but rather you need specifically revelation, and not just revelation, you need their particular hidden revelation, which they're about to make open to you. It is you get the in on the secret, and we're gonna publish and tell you about it and print it up, and we're gonna do all kinds of things to make sure that you believe in this belief of a newly structured world, and that this is actually goes way back. That mitzvot, when you do them, it's not just something that's good for the world and good for society. Every single time you do a mitzvah, it repairs the ruptures in the divine world. Doing a mitzvah allows the energy to come down through the spherot and then into the world and restores it, just like in ways that they would think of similar to the conjunction of male and female. Doing mitzvot is like that. And you need to study this by getting it from a reliable teacher. And that's why it's called Kabbalah, right? Because you have to receive it from a teacher. Not about speculation. It's about receiving a tradition that's authoritative, and this is how you're going to get it. And again, I am not one of those people who believes that it's all made up. I believe that a lot of this goes back to earlier material, that they reused a lot of your earlier material, but it doesn't. The Zohar doesn't do much for me. I will be very clear. It has had a huge impact on modern Judaism. That is from early modern period through contemporary times. In the 19th century, it was actively suppressed by German rationalist Jews who didn't like the emphasis on the Zohar, but it's come back, and people are studying it and are finding in it all kinds of interesting ideas, especially more egalitarian ideas, images of the divine feminine that they find useful. Personally, I get hung up on the xenophobia that is built in about non-Jews. And yes, as Stephen pointed out, right, Hasidism is deeply rooted in it, although they create an entirely different model to it. But it's not true that Nagdim generally didn't go for it. I will point you to a really very important. Nagdim means those people who were opposed to Hasidism. The Vilna Gaon himself was a major Kabbalah expert in Kabbalah. What the difference was that he didn't want to teach it to people. He adopted the norms that it really had to be taught viva voce, with a live voice to people. You can't just like write stuff about this. Chabad totally popularized it. Hasidus broadly popularized it. And do I think of Hasidism as mainstream Judaism? I have a real hard time with talking about Hasidism as a thing, because it was actually lots of different things. Every Hasidic group elevated their Rebbe as being the Rebbe, and they were never united, and are still not. They are tremendously hostile towards each other. But I think there's we can't ignore the depth of the impact of Kabbalistic ideas on especially on the Sephardic Jews who came to this country, and who were the first Jews who came to this country, and the huge impact that Kabbalah has had, not just in the Sephardic world, but through Hasidism on modern Judaism. It's, look, my son made fun of me earlier this week by saying that by noting when I was saying I've spent a huge amount of time over the past 3 weeks studying about Kabbalah, and he was saying, yeah, studying about Kabbalah as not trying to do something spiritual or to study Kabbalah itself, but studying about Kabbalah, about the history of Kabbalah. Yes, that's who I am. I admit, I am a rationalist, not like the Rambam exactly, but I'm not this. It doesn't do it for me, but I have to acknowledge that it had a huge impact on us as Jews. It has a huge impact on our Siddur, and I think we have to take a look at with open eyes how the Siddur, the Guide for the Perplexed, and the Zohar really laid us up, or set us up for the emergence of Judaism in the early modern and modern period. I'm going to just check through these chats to see if there's anything I missed. Strict constructions of more mystical classes. Yeah, okay, I get it. The emergence of there's a lot of really great new scholarship on the emergence of Hasidism. It's worth looking at, but I'll tell you, if you want a really great read, and it's not something that we're going to talk about, Alan Nadler wrote a book called The Faith of the Mitnagdim. I was totally captivated by the book, and it's about these people who opposed Hasidic movement, and it clarifies all kinds of really useful things. So next week, we have our 5th of 6 sections, and we're going to be looking at the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch and the responses to the Shulchan Aruch. Those of you who go to Minyan, well, I guess you haven't had this for a bit since the birth of Jonah Zev, but the Shulchan Aruch is the document that Rabbi Spitzer has been teaching during Minyan, and I hope that you will enjoy looking at this, and people who go to Minyan who aren't here may want to just step in for the one session to get a better sense, and if you want to pass that information on to them, it would probably be worthwhile to get a sense of the conflict that caused the Shulchan Aruch to emerge in the way that we have it, and the conflicts that emerged as a result of its being published. So if there aren't any more questions, I will send you off and wish you a very good week. I'm actually going to be in Skiuna on Sunday, and then I'll come back here and proceed to quarantine. But I'm going to get to finally see Jonah Zev, and I get to see Rafi, Rachel, and Ellie too, and that's really wonderful also. But looking forward to seeing the grandson. And if I see any of you on the street, I will wave from social distance. Anyway, take care.
Yes,
And
of course. Yes, of
have
course.
a great evening.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Oh, Jeff. Well done.
Do you have time for a very quick question?
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm of the impression, maybe my knowledge about this is wrong, that by the late 19th century, Kabbalah was not talked about much. Was it at the coming of the Enlightenment that it started to get de-emphasized?
So Kabbalah was not talked about much by Jews in Germany, who were actively suppressing it, because it was seen as in response to Gretz, and Gretz reflected it, that it was seen as this, bastard daughter that just emerged from nothing because they didn't like the Rambam, God forbid, and they suppressed it because it wasn't real for them. And honestly, I have to say I'm an inheritor of that tradition. I mean, I studied at JTS, and the people who founded it were people who were Yekis. They were people with a German Jewish cultural background, I think the same would be true also of people like Schechter, who is in a British orbit. But I think that it was still being studied actively by Jews in North Africa, by Jews in Syria, by Jews all over the Sephardic world, by Jews in Eastern Europe who were Hasidish. There were Jews who were still what we would call nowadays Haredi, but like the people who were in Vilna, and it would be hard to say that people who were not in Germany, I mean, people in Lithuania, they were studying the Kabbalah, but they didn't study it broadly, right? Hasidism made it like common, and then there was the popularized Kabbalah aspects, right? We've got a passage like Be'an Arachitz is a passage from the Zohar, and it's in our Siddur, right? How to get into our Siddur? We didn't take it out, but it's there. And there are all kinds of Kabbalistic things that we do, like when we sing Hineni Muchanum Zuman L'Kayim Mitzvat Aseh Shel Sfirat HaOmer. What are they doing, right? When you're making a kavanah like that, you're saying my intention in performing this mitzvah is actually to unite the Sfirot. That's what the point behind all of these kavanot are. And to say that, I mean, it had a huge impact. Do we buy into it all? I like saying kavanot, but do I think that I'm actually causing the shefa, the divine flow, to flow through and come into the Shekhinah and unite Shekhinah with Keter? No, but I like the idea of intentionality. I like the idea that my mitzvot, as I perform them, do something at a cosmic level. But I don't really believe that. But I like the metaphor. So I mean, there were Jews there. I mean, it was in the literature, it was suppressed. In real life, it was still there. Okay.
It sounds like it was suppressed where Napoleon didn't go.
Yeah.
Or where Napoleon did go.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That answers it very thoroughly.
Okay. But again, an Alan Nadler book, really worthwhile.
Yeah. I'll go look that up.
Okay. Well, take care. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, thanks for staying and answering.
Okay. I'm still in share mode. I didn't need to do that.
It's all good.
Okay. And where's the